El Salvador, do you want to hear some statistics that'll make your jaw drop? How about the fact that 4% of the country owns more than 60% of all of the land? Or that in a single day, the police log in 27 murders? Maybe it's the fact that 10% of the entire population are gang members, and that's just the ones on record. Whatever you just heard, cut those numbers in half, because that's what one man managed to do in just 5 years. Somehow, the new president managed to turn a literal war zone around into a place where kids can play outside again and neighbors aren't hosing blood off the sidewalk on a daily basis. Meet President Nayib Bukele, who fought violence with violence, stomping out the criminals and the gangs at a rate that the world has never seen before. No one thought it could be done, but somehow he did. And here's how he did it. El Salvador has seen its fair share of ups and downs, and let's be honest, it's been mostly downs since the civil war that started up in the 80s and raged on for 14 years. Getting into how the gangs began to take over is a whole video on its own. The Cold War and the commie/cappy tug of war to make their mark on every country that they could get their hands on. Well, the small country of El Salvador was just thrown into the chaos of the superpowers' war against one another. Any country that was left in the state that El Salvador was bound to spiral out of control. But what puts this small Central American country apart from similar cases is the massive amount of weapons left behind. That, and the fact that most of the gangs that sprung up in these desperate times were led by men who'd received top-notch military training from the USA, Russia, or Cuba. These were not the small-time street thugs that were happy to swindle their day-to-day operations in the back streets. No. These were decorated soldiers who knew how to arm, organize, and enforce their control over the majority of the country. In 2017, a whopping 10% of the country was a gang member, and probably twice that amount were at least affiliated with a gang in some way or another. MS-13 is by far the biggest and most successful gang of the lot, but that doesn't mean that there aren't others. They controlled most of the country and even went so far as to charge shopkeepers and food vendors a 40% tax to conduct business in the districts that they controlled. The gangs quite literally ran the economy with guns, violence, and drugs. Since the 80s, there have been attempts to get things under control by enforcing harsher sentences, sending military troops in. But this was a futile attempt. There were just too many of them. They were spread out in between civilians, and most of the time they had more firepower than the military did. When this didn't work, there was an attempt made to negotiate with the leaders instead, but as you can imagine, this backfired spectacularly. This back and forth went on for the better part of 40 years. Every time a new president was elected, he'd try a different tactic that just never delivered the results that people were hoping for. That's until Nayib Bukele stepped into the role of president. While running for president, this guy was so popular among the people that he didn't even bother to attend the presidential debate. Instead of wasting his time on a stage, he spent some time with the people of El Salvador, on the ground. While the other candidates took the day off to attend the show pony affair, he was doing actual work, while fools stood squawking behind a podium. Bukele was a man of action, not empty promises. Now this guy employs unusual tactics, to say the least. But that's exactly what El Salvador needed. When it came to voting, the people didn't want a diplomat. The ones who had taken up the presidency and tried to use diplomacy to get a lid on the problem weren't exactly successful in the past. And the militant approaches just left more civilians dead than there would have been if the gangs were just left free to go about their business as before. Adding more guns was just adding fuel to the fire. They needed someone who stood somewhere in the middle of those 2 points. And that guy was Bukele. He's modern and educated enough to bring diplomacy to the table, but he's tough as nails and he doesn't underestimate the enemy. Every campaign, every thought, and all the goings-on is blasted on his social media for everyone to see. His Twitter feed read like a newsreel. This guy wants change, and he was keeping the citizens in the loop every step of the way. And when we say he's got balls, we mean it. The moment he got elected, he started running the country like a corporate office. The ones who were sowing death and chaos had to go. He employed a zero-tolerance policy toward the gangs, even going so far as to raise the maximum sentencing for convictions to 40 years. Most countries in South America are legally unable to sentence anyone for longer than 20 years, no matter how many people they killed or what amount of illegalities they got up to land them in jail in the first place. The military is now the reigning enforcers of the law, because by the time Bukele stepped up to the plate, most of the police force and half the government were in the pockets of the gangs anyway. This deeply ingrained corruption of officials led to Bukele pulling back on his open book policy. But thus far, he'd delivered on his promises, so the people weren't going to start questioning him now. Now, if he wants to push a new law and the rest won't agree with him, he marches his armed military into the room to intimidate the most powerful judges and ministers in the country. A lot of people have accused him of turning El Salvador into an authoritarian state. But if history is to be observed, well, capitalism, communism, Marxism, you name it, every president has tried it at one point or another, and none of it's worked. Bukele, with his swanky suit and the air of no-nonsense that he conducts business with, knew that almost every person in any seat of power was not to be trusted. The ones who'd managed to survive assassinations were only alive because they played by the gang's rules themselves. And unlike other authoritarian states, Bukele's made improvements to the country's broken infrastructure as he went along. The people of El Salvador haven't had too many complaints about how he runs things. They knew drastic measures had to be taken, and a new, tougher system had to be put in place to do it. El Salvador is standing behind the man they'd voted for by a huge majority. He declared every gang member a terrorist and constructed the biggest prison in Latin America. The place is called the Terrorist Confinement Center, capable of housing 40,000 prisoners at a time. This guy wasn't going to cement his place in history by building a grand castle. Bukele likes to make statements in a more practical way instead. At all times, 20 to 30,000 military and police personnel are marching through the streets in an attempt to bring order to the nation. By declaring gangs as terrorists and enforcing the ability to imprison them for longer, Bukele's rule was sure to see some pretty significant drops in crime, right? Wrong. For 2 years, the gangs just pushed back harder, putting every ounce of effort into breaking another man on the throne, like they'd done to everyone else in the presidential seat for all these years. In the past, they just needed to endure for longer than authorities did, and they'd eventually wear them down. The street killings were now so extreme that seeing 60 deaths a day was becoming a common occurrence. Bukele made a move that was usually reserved for dictators. He declared a state of exception. The difference between Bukele and a dictator is that Bukele notified every member of Congress and the whole country before he sent his troops out, and the citizens were all for it. They placed their trust in the president, going along with the new state of affairs with virtually no pushback. A state of exception means that for a month, police and military can go out into the streets and arrest anyone without needing to prove to any judge or authority that the person was guilty or not before putting them behind bars to await trial. Civilians' rights and liberties were to be suspended for this period of mass searches and arrests. For the next month, 98% of the country was searched, with almost every citizen opening their doors freely for the searchers to come into their houses. The world was floored by the bold and aggressive move, calling it a crime against human rights. Even those who just had gang tattoos were thrown into prison. The amount of weapons and drugs that were seized is astronomical. Never before in history had anyone who wielded so much finality not gone mad with power. But the public were right to trust the young go-getter. For the first time in 40 years, after more than 70,000 arrests, leaving 2% of the entire population behind bars, El Salvador became the country with the highest incarceration rate in the world overnight. But the payoff was enormous. The criminals that did manage to escape justice were forced out of the cities and districts that they controlled, throwing them into farming communities or quite literally into the wilderness to escape. The power of the gangs was shattered, and their chain of command was dispersed into the ether. With no one left to enforce order, shopkeepers could conduct business without being shaken down for all of their income. Kids could walk to school without fear of having the clothes mugged off their backs. Cars could drive with their windows open. Murder rates have gone down by almost 60%, and Bukele has a 90% approval rating from civilians. For all the criticism he's received from higher-ups and the outside world, isn't it the very people on the ground, the El Salvadoran citizens, who should get the most say? The only problems he has to deal with now are the prisons bursting at the seams with overcrowding, rebuilding a broken country that's practically been facing war for the last 40 years, and to keep it that way. Because make no mistake, the gangs have tried to reorganize, but with the very real reality of the repercussions for their actions now facing them, most gang members just aren't willing to take the risk. So the few who are trying to bring back the old lawless system just can't get enough traction, no matter how much they try to threaten and extort the citizens anymore. This extreme takeover hasn't been without its problems. The tip lines set in place to report suspected gang activity have been misused by the public to settle petty scores with each other, and the state of siege hasn't quite been released entirely. Military and police presence hasn't decreased at all, and they're still operating with the same impunity that they did during that month free of legal red tape, arresting people for even the flimsiest suspicions. And when an arrest is made, those prisoners disappear for months, their families kept completely in the dark about their whereabouts or whether or not their sons and daughters are even alive. It's not like life in prison has improved since Bukele's takedown. South American prisons overall have never been known for their safety. Food and medical facilities are a fraction of what they should be. Violence goes unchecked, and police brutality is extreme and a lot of the time fatal. Coming out alive is a minor miracle in and of itself. Bukele is not making any moves or excuses for the deplorable conditions. He's got the attitude that terrorists don't have the same rights that the rest of the law-abiding citizens do. He'd rather spend his time rebuilding schools and hospitals than waste his resources on murderers and rapists. And who can argue with his logic? The gang problem was quite literally comparable to war conditions, even surpassing death rates in countries that are currently in open conflict. The extreme conditions that Salvadorians were living in required extreme solutions. But when is the military presence finally going to release its hold? For now, the relief of living without fear again, while infrastructure and living conditions have very obviously improved, is enough to keep the public on his side. But it's only a matter of time before the police state conditions start wearing people down. Already reports of police killings are commonplace. Usually they're against criminals who are armed themselves, so it's been easy to justify. But this brutality has started to extend to the courts and the ministerial officials. If anyone dares accuse Bukele of corruption or question the morality of his takedown, the individuals are shaken down and investigated with a shocking amount of force. Several members of parliament and high court judges have fled the country for fear of prosecution already. But for all the world's worry and criticism, the El Salvador public still stands behind their president. Because finally, families can live and thrive without fear of being gunned down if they step foot out their door. They trust him to do what's necessary until the time is right to transition into a normal state of operation. And they aren't the only ones. Quite a few countries in South America are considering copying Bukele's methods. in an attempt to get their gangs, drug lords, and human trafficking rings under control. Costa Rica's putting out the possibility as we speak, and their citizens are almost all for the transition. For now, we'll just have to wait and see what Bukele does next. If he keeps going this way, El Salvador will be virtually crime-free in the next 5 years. But when that happens, and it almost surely will the man be willing to relinquish his complete control over the country and allow his people true freedom again? If history has taught us anything, that's how dictators are made. They get power through talks of good intentions and peace in hard times. But once they've had complete power over the lives of their people for long enough, it corrupts them from the inside out. Maybe Bukele is different. So far, he and the people of El Salvador certainly believe so. But what do you think? Is the answer to fight violence with violence? And can a man truly step down when the time is right? Or will El Salvador remain a police state for the rest of eternity? Let us know in the comments below. And like always, subscribe and share. Every bit of engagement is what makes it possible for our team to bring you all the latest updates in the geopolitical sphere. Until next time, bye.